Committee on Homeland Security will come to order. During today's virtual hearing, members are responsible for muting and unmuting themselves. When you are recognized to speak, if I notice that you have not unmuted yourself, I will ask you if you would like the staff to unmute you. If you indicate approval by nodding, staff will unmute your microphone. To avoid inadvertent background noise, the chair or staff designated by the chair may mute participant microphones when they are not recognized to speak. If there is a technology issue during a member's speaking time, we will move to the next member until the issue is resolved, and you will retain the balance of your time. We will be following the 5-minute rule. With 1 minute remaining in your time, the clock on your screen will turn yellow. When your time has expired, the clock will turn red, and it will be time to recognize the next member. We will follow the speaking order set forth in the House rules, beginning with the chair and ranking member, followed by members present at the time of the hearing is called to order, in order of seniority, and we will alternate by party. Next, we will go to members who were not present when the hearing was called to order until every member present has had a first round. Members can submit information in writing at any of our hearings or markups using the email address provided in advance to your staff. Now let's begin. I'm going to keep my opening remarks brief to allow maximum time for questions. I welcome the Honorable Alejandro Mayorkas, Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security, who is here to discuss the department's operations and resource requirements. Mr. Secretary, this is your first appearance before the subcommittee in your current role, but you are certainly not new to the department and its diverse set of missions. I can think of no one more qualified to lead the department at this very challenging time. We scheduled this hearing with you late in the month, hoping that we could discuss the details of the department's fiscal year 2022 budget request. Unfortunately, we will not be getting the full budget request until Friday, which means you are limited in what you can say about it. Nevertheless, I hope to have a good discussion this morning, not only about the current operations of the department and the use of its appropriated resources, but also about what it will take to continue addressing the many challenges you face in the coming fiscal year. Mr. Secretary, I recently visited the border with you, and I want to commend all the DHS personnel who have been working so hard over the last few months to manage an incredibly difficult challenge. Working closely with the Department of Health and Human Services, you were able to reduce the number of unaccompanied children in CBP custody from over 5,000 to now around 500. And I understand that CBP and ICE recently established a coordination cell to help prevent overcrowding of families at CBP facilities. We look forward to seeing progress on this as quickly as possible. Your department is also facing a significant challenge in the cybersecurity area, with several breaches of government and private sector systems over the past several months. The Colonial Pipeline breach, in particular, was a wake-up call to many Americans about how malicious cyber actors, often backed by foreign states, can disrupt the U.S. economy and all of our lives. I was pleased to hear yesterday about the impending TSA directive on pipeline cybersecurity reporting. I was surprised, however, to have found out about it in the press, particularly given our engagement with TSA and CISA on the Colonial Pipeline issue over the past few weeks. Mr. Secretary, since January 2020, the department has seen 51 line-of-duty deaths, 43 of which were reported as related to COVID-19. On behalf of the subcommittee, I convey our most sincere condolences to the families and colleagues of the members of the DHS family who have lost their lives over the last year. Mr. Secretary, the department has a varied and challenging mission set that is not always fully appreciated. And I want you to know this subcommittee does appreciate what you and the 240,000 men and women who work for you do every day to help keep our nation safe. Please convey to the men and women of the department that they have our continued support during this very challenging time, that we will continue to do our best to provide the resources necessary to protect their health and well-being, and that they have our deep gratitude for their service to our country. I now turn to the distinguished gentleman from Tennessee, Ranking Member Fleischman, for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your presence here today and for stepping up to serve at a most difficult and challenging time in our nation's history, sir. I welcome you to the subcommittee, and I thank you for reaching out to me the other week. I very much enjoyed our conversation, and I look forward to meeting with you in person as soon as possible. I know we are all hoping that we would have had a chance to talk about the fiscal year 2022 budget for the Department of Homeland Security, but timing is not on our side. I'm sure your people have briefed you up and down on all the facts and figures, so please feel free to share any budget information with us today that you would deem helpful. We have had some very positive oversight and readiness hearings with the components of this department: Coast Guard, Secret Service, TSA, CISA, FEMA, CPB, and ICE. And it's good to know that you have some very capable leaders and people in the components working to keep our country safe. I wish we could have discussed the budget proposal, but we covered a lot of ground in our earlier hearings. Mr. Secretary, though, there are some difficult issues that this administration needs to address about the security at our borders and our infrastructure and how laws are upheld. As the Secretary, we are looking to you to provide answers. I fear we are at a crisis point. Border apprehensions are at an all-time high, but ICE apprehensions are at an all-time low. We have lost balance. I have been to the southwest border this year, as well as in the past, to meet with agents and officers on the front lines. We have hundreds of youths coming through an airport in Chattanooga on the way to HHS facilities across the region. What we are seeing today is not sustainable, and I'm not seeing any actions from the administration that progress is being made to address these problems. Instead, we're just seeing more problems. I told Mr. Johnson with ICE when he was with us about 2 weeks ago that ICE is a crucial component in our ability to enforce immigration, customs, and trade laws in this country. The Washington Post last night published an article about how ICE is basically doing nothing because they have been basically told not to do their jobs. Now, this was a Washington Post article. I worry that without operational law enforcement, we will lose the battle against bad actors coming into our country, unvetted, cartels, smugglers, and traffickers. If the administration continues to send the signal that people who enter the country illegally face no consequence for breaking the law, the cartels are emboldened to continue victimizing people and raising their profits by exploiting a lax system. I do look forward to your testimony today and everyone's questions. As appropriators, we must come to an agreement for the annual spending bill. I am sure we are all up to the task, and I am optimistic we can return some balance to the system. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Madam Chair, I yield back the remainder of my time.
Mr. Secretary, we will submit the full text of your official statement for the hearing record. Please begin your oral summary, which I would ask that you keep to 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Roybal-Allard, Ranking Member Fleischman, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Good morning. I very much appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. The Department of Homeland Security is confronting serious, complex, and dynamic threats to the security of our nation on a daily basis. Under the Biden-Harris administration, we are aggressively pursuing efforts to address our most pressing security concerns, from cybersecurity to domestic violent extremism to the COVID-19 pandemic and more. This is hard work, but that is what 240,000 colleagues in the Department of Homeland Security do every day. Their dedicated efforts keep our communities safe and secure and the resources afforded by this Congress help ensure we can effectively meet our mission and recruit and retain our nation's most talented professionals. The President's proposed budget will invest in our broad mission set, including preventing terrorism, securing and managing our borders, repairing the broken immigration system, safeguarding cyber and critical infrastructure, and strengthening national preparedness and resilience. It will provide DHS with the resources we need to keep our country safe, strong, and prosperous. While I am unable to address specific details of the President's budget until it is officially released later this week, I welcome this opportunity to discuss several key agency priorities for fiscal year 2022 laid out in the President's $52.2 billion discretionary request for DHS. This request includes approximately $1.2 billion for border infrastructure improvements to fund modernization of our land ports of entry and border security technology, and to ensure the safe and humane treatment of migrants in Customs and Border Protection custody. It would also support our enhanced efforts to combat the smuggling and trafficking of people, illicit drugs, and weapons, while providing for more efficient travel, trade, and commerce. We are working tirelessly to rebuild our immigration system into one that upholds our nation's laws and is fair, equitable, and reflects our values. To achieve this, the fiscal year 2022 request includes $345 million to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services to address naturalization, asylum, and other program backlogs. The budget request also supports up to 125,000 refugee admissions for fiscal year 2022. To meet the President's bold vision for combating climate change, the discretionary request includes an additional investment of $540 million above the fiscal year 2021 enacted level to increase resilience efforts and enhance pre-disaster planning. It will support resiliency in infrastructure, particularly for vulnerable and historically underserved communities. And it would resource the Federal Emergency Management Agency with the ability to hire additional staff to prepare and respond to the increasing number of emergencies and disasters our nation has experienced. In recent months, DHS has made it a top priority to address domestic violent extremism, which I believe to be the most lethal and persistent terrorism-related threat to the United States today. The fiscal year 2022 request includes $131 million to support innovative methods to prevent domestic violent extremism while reflecting and respecting privacy, civil rights, and civil liberties. It also supports critical research of the root causes of radicalization, enhanced community outreach, and funding for locally driven efforts. Finally, in the face of increasing cyber threats, it is critical that we promote resilience not only within the federal government, but across the public and private sectors and our critical infrastructure systems. The recent ransomware attack on the Colonial Pipeline serves as a stark example of this ever-present threat. Our discretionary request includes $2.1 billion for our Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, which leads DHS in interagency efforts to defend against today's threats and build a more secure and resilient future. We will also further strengthen the cyber capabilities of the Transportation Security Administration, the U.S. Secret Service, Homeland Security Investigations, and the U.S. Coast Guard. The budget also proposes $618 million for needed investments in research and development and innovation across DHS, laying out a strong foundation to not just respond to the threats of today, but prepare for and defend against the threats of tomorrow. Thank you for the opportunity to be here today. I am grateful for your continued support for the dedicated public servants of the Department of Homeland Security and for the work they do each and every day. I look forward to discussing the President's proposed fiscal year 2022 budget in greater detail when officially released, and I welcome your questions today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I want to commend you and the DHS personnel who have been working so hard over the last few months to manage an incredibly difficult situation on our southern border. Significant challenges remain, of course, but you and your team have been able to impose order on what otherwise could have spiraled into an unmanageable situation. Can you update us on the current status of the border, what trends you are seeing, and how they may be different from what we saw during the last major influx of migrants in 2019?
Thank you very much, Madam Chairwoman. I must echo your commendation of our frontline personnel, of course, the United States Border Patrol, also the men and women of FEMA and U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, whom we have deployed to address the influx of unaccompanied children at our border. You correctly noted that we have reduced the number of unaccompanied children in Border Patrol custody from almost 5,000 children a little bit more than 30 days ago to less than 600 today. We continue to see the migration, the irregular migration of unaccompanied children, but we continue in our success of managing that flow, moving those children more rapidly to HHS shelters that are properly equipped to address the needs of unaccompanied children. And we are re-engineering the process from beginning to end, not only to achieve the more facile and expeditious movement of the children from Border Patrol facilities to Health and Human Services facilities, but importantly, to more expeditiously move those children from the HHS facilities to the parents and legal guardians who are responsible for their care here in the United States. So we continue with our success. The challenge is not behind us, but nor is the progress in re-engineering to better improve the system. And so I appreciate that opportunity.
Now, DHS continues to use the Title 42 authority granted by CDC in March 2020 to rapidly expel most migrants. When do you think the Title 42 authority will be lifted, and are there specific metrics that the CDC will use to make this decision?
The Title 42 authority that we employ to expel individuals and family members at the border is the authority of CDC. And it is based upon a public health imperative. And we use it based upon the CDC's assessment of the public health conditions and what is needed to protect the health and safety of the American public and the migrants themselves. We are watching the data, we are watching the science led by the CDC, and we will no longer rely upon Title 42 when there is no longer a public health imperative basis to do so. We do not have metrics, we in the Department of Homeland Security. It is not necessarily based on the flows that we see, but rather the public health details and facts that underlie our actions. And we are in close touch on a daily basis with the CDC to understand the public health conditions that serve as a predicate for our use of that authority.
Okay. Well, once Title 42 does go away, CBP will begin giving migrants full due process as required by law, such as the right to claim asylum. How are you preparing for this change, and what additional resources will be needed to effectively manage it?
Madam Chairwoman, we in the Department of Homeland Security, our personnel have dealt with surges many times before. These surges occur periodically and more specifically, seasonally. we are not only looking at the tools that we have historically used under our different authorities, under Title VIII of the United States Code, but once again, we're looking at the processes that we have and how we can build upon them and improve them. And so we are looking at, for example, the asylum system and the duration, the length of time it takes to achieve a final adjudication, and how we can use our regulatory authorities to bring far greater efficiency to that system. So we are looking not only at the tools that we historically have had, but also how we can improve the processes that have existed. And it is our sincere hope and our urge that Congress pass legislation to reform a system that we all understand to be so fundamentally broken.
Mr. Fleischman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And again, Mr. Secretary, thank you for being with us today. As you know, sir, I want to thank you again, and my colleagues know that when I deal with administration officials in any administration, such as yourself, I want to deal with you with the utmost civility and respect. But today, sir, I've got to ask some very pointed questions, and I do that with the utmost respect towards you and towards your office. But I'm deeply troubled, sir. In my opening statement, I mentioned the recent article from the Washington Post about the near shutdown of the agency charged with enforcing our nation's immigration laws. The Washington Post states the agency's 6,000 officers currently average one arrest every 2 months. One arrest every 2 months. My first question, sir, is that an accurate statistic? And is that the intended outcome of the various orders and directives, a near stop of all immigration violation arrests, sir?
Mr. Ranking Member, I have a few things to say, if I may, and let me answer your question at the top and then address, if I may, a few of your preliminary remarks. That is a data point with which I am completely unfamiliar. I do not believe it is accurate, and we will provide your office with accurate data. I think there are a few important things to say in addition to that. Number one, I very much appreciated our conversation a few weeks ago and the respect that you have for this office and for our department, and the support that you provide to the men and women of our department. And I welcome the pointed questions. I well understand it is our shared responsibility to both ask pointed questions and to deliver answers for them. Law enforcement effectiveness is not a quantitative issue. It is a qualitative one. The question is, as to whom are we dedicating our resources? What will deliver the greatest public safety results for the American public? And that is what I am focused on. And I have a tremendous amount of experience in this realm, not only because of my service in the Department of Homeland Security, but my 12 years of service in the United States Department of Justice as a federal prosecutor, investigating and prosecuting criminals for 9 years on the front lines, in the trenches, in a federal courtroom, as well as serving as a United States attorney for 3 years.
Yes,
and so I'm very well aware of what is needed to deliver for the American public the public safety that we all deserve and to which we aspire.
And I do acknowledge and honor your experience, sir. But another quote from this article: one of the priority groups, recent border crossers, are effectively no longer subject to arrest once they reach the U.S. interior. I have two questions, sir. Two separate sets of questions. Is this true? Has President Biden already abandoned the directive that recent border crossers would be held to basic immigration laws? And then as a follow-up, Are there no consequences for illegally crossing the border at this point? Because frankly, sir, it appears that President Biden's message to one and all is that the U.S. has no limits to whom can come because the administration will not enforce any of its immigration laws. Is that the message this country will not enforce its immigration laws? And I will let you respond, sir.
No, it is not. And the president could not have been clearer in his articulation of this administration's position, nor could I have been clearer and continued to be so, which is the border is closed. And this administration administers and enforces the laws of the United States of America. And that is not only the laws of accountability, but also the humanitarian laws that Congress passed many years ago. And there are three priority areas specifically and explicitly articulated in both the January 20th memorandum of then acting Secretary Pekoski and the February 8th guidance of acting ICE Director Kay Johnson. And those three priority areas are national security, public safety, and border security. And border security is specifically defined as recent border crossers. And I think that those documents and our actions speak powerfully to the fact that the border is closed and that we enforce the laws that Congress has passed. But we will do so effectively to ensure the greatest impact and outcome from the resources that we have.
Mr. Secretary, my time has expired. I thank you for your responses, and I will reserve for round two. Madam Chair, I yield back. Thank you.
Mr. Cuellar.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, Ranking Member, Mr. Secretary. Thank you so much for what you do. Some of us have dealt with Homeland Secretary since the Bush administration. Everybody comes in with their own thoughts and philosophies, and I understand that. And no matter what you do, some people think you're doing too little. Some people think you're doing too much. So I know you have a very complicated job, and we want to be as supportive as we can to help you succeed. My question is, I need for you to help me give a message to my border communities. What would you tell my border communities when we talk about reopening the southwest border to non-essential travel? In Laredo, for example, downtown Laredo on bridge number 1, there's been about 150 businesses that have closed. People that got their earned savings, they lost their businesses, they lost their savings because one, you had the COVID-19 situation, the pandemic, and on top of that, some of those businesses depend on 30, 40, 50% on the Mexican shoppers. Some of them are asking me, why is it that the Mexicans can fly in or the undocumented people can come in through either a bridge in Laredo through the metering system, or at the bus stations we see them, or at the airports in Laredo, and I see them every time I fly to DC, families going into the interior. So we have done everything. Talk to the Mexicans. I talked to your health advisor, Gary. He's an excellent person. I've talked to CDC. In fact, this Friday, I have a call with DHS, CDC, NIH on border openings. I've talked to the Mexicans. Everybody says we're ready to open up this month. I'm hoping that we can get some good news, Mr. Secretary, because when we said it was temporary restrictions, it's been over a year, and that word temporary, to me, thought it was going to be a little earlier. I know it's health driven. I understand that. I'm with you. But what message could you give us of some hope and optimism to my border communities from Laredo down to the valley and up and down the border from California, New Mexico, Arizona? And of course, I know it affects the northern border, but give us some news that hopefully this month will be the last time that at least we can open up in a phase-in way. And I understand it's health-driven. I understand. I just want to be very helpful to you to help you open up the border.
Thank you very much, Congressman. I had the privilege of visiting the border with you when I served as Deputy Secretary, and I know how much of a champion you are for those border communities. And thank you also for mentioning Gary. That's Gary Rassicot, who is a fantastic public servant. I'm going to take the luxury of 30 seconds since we did give a shout out. I must give a shout out to the budget team of the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, which is just as good as it gets. I must say, Congressman, we are watching not only the public health situation on a daily basis, but also the economic situation on a daily basis, and we very well understand the economic consequences of our use of Title 42 on the one hand, and more importantly, the public health situation that it reflects and its impact on the border communities, and how much the flow of people and goods, its criticality to the prosperity of those border communities. We confer every single day on that, and the assurance that I can give the people whom you represent and throughout the border communities on our southern border and on the northern border is that we will not restrict travel one day more than the public health imperative requires. That is the assurance I can give.
All right, thank you. I know I got about 20 seconds left, but so we are going to have this conversation, and hopefully you will allow your Undersecretary Gary to join us so we can talk to CDC, because last time I talked to CDC, they said it was Homeland's decision, and then you're telling me that it's the CDC. So hopefully you will allow him to be part of this conversation on Friday morning on that. But thank you again for your service. I have some other questions, but I'll save it for the second round. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Congressman. And let me be clear, and I apologize if I wasn't. This is an all-of-government effort, and we are working across the federal government enterprise to make these decisions.
Mr. Palazzo. Mr. Palazzo? I will then go to Mr. Rutherford.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Ranking Member and Mr. Secretary. It's great to be with you. Listen, I first want to ask you a question about, I know I read with actually great delight the support from your administration and the President concerning the Jones Act. And I think that is critical to our national security, that we have a strong maritime organization in this country, and I think the Jones Act helps in that regard. But I do want to ask a question, because I see when the Colonial pipeline shutdown occurred, there were two Jones Act waivers granted. We see them being granted during hurricanes oftentimes, but it's my understanding that during these two requests for waivers, one vessel never arrived until the weekend when things were actually back up and running, and the second waiver might never be used. So my question is, Mr. Secretary, are we getting to a point where these Jones Act waivers almost become, a box that's checked when we have any kind of national disaster? Because I don't know that is helpful for our maritime industry.
Congressman, thank you very much. The Jones Act is a very important statutory framework to protect American flagged vessels, the Colonial Pipeline cyber attack that emanated from a very pernicious use of ransomware, with which we are all too familiar, posed a very significant threat to the flow of materials that are much needed in a particular region of the United States. And we by no means addressed the waiver requests in a check-the-box approach. Far from that. We worked around the clock, methodically and thoroughly, assessing the statutory requirements, addressing the question whether, in fact, American flag vessels were sufficient to deliver product on an emergency basis. And we made the decision that, in fact, they were not. And if, in fact, the region needed a supplemental supply because Colonial Pipeline could not come through in time and bring its system back up, that we would permit foreign flagged vessels to bring the much needed supply to the American people. Whether or not those waiver requests were used speak of Colonial Pipeline's ability to bring its systems back up and deliver in a timely fashion. But we felt, as a matter of law and as a matter of the market, the assessment was that we needed to have that facility available should, in fact, Colonial Pipeline not be able to come through. That was a very measured, scientific, and legal analysis under the law.
Okay. Thank you very much for that. You know, the administration is facing several crises at one time here. We've got an economic crisis with the inflation that is creeping in, the energy crisis, and I want to talk a minute about the national security crisis also, and looking at domestic violence intervention. Domestic violent extremists. And I noticed your national priority area, one of them was for the UASI, was for DVEs. And as a former police officer, I really do appreciate that focus. Can you talk a little bit about the $20 million that you just directed toward targeting violence prevention and terrorist prevention?
Thank you very much, Congressman. And also, thank you very much for your prior service as a police officer. I had the privilege of bringing police officer work to bear in a federal courtroom and vindicate the tremendous work that law enforcement performed. The $20 million grant program is to equip communities, our state, local, tribal, and territorial partners to develop innovative programs to address the rise of domestic violent extremism and the serious threat that it poses. And that grant program is designed to equip local communities, because as you well know, it is the local communities, the neighborhoods, the people, the family, loved ones, friends, who can identify individuals who are beginning to exhibit traits of concern and intervene so that we can prevent the further development of violent tendencies born of hateful ideologies and extreme ideologies. It's the front lines that are our best defense to preventing this type of violence. And so that grant program is designed to resource and equip our local authorities and our non-governmental institutions in that fight.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. And I'll have a follow-up in the second round on that. Madam Chair, I see my time has expired. I yield back.
Ms. Underwood.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, and Mr. Secretary. It is a pleasure to see you here today. The Chairwoman and I are both concerned about shortcomings in the way medical services are managed across the department, both for DHS personnel and for individuals in custody. Mr. Secretary, I understand that you and the Chairwoman have discussed this issue and that you share our concerns as well. The department's chief medical office is currently isolated, confusingly within the Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction office. Rather than reporting directly to you, the CMO instead reports to the assistant secretary in charge of that Countering Weapons of Mass Destruction office. At the same time, each DHS component has its own medical officer overseeing its own medical contracts, leading to disparate guidelines and little to no meaningful coordination across the department. Mr. Secretary, what's your view on how the current organizational structure hinders coordination and effectiveness of medical services across DHS?
Congresswoman, thank you very much for your question. This is an issue that indeed I did discuss with the Chairwoman, and an issue that I am studying very closely with our team here in the Department of Homeland Security. We have an extraordinary Chief Medical Officer in Dr. Pritesh Gandhi. And I am concerned that our organization is too fractured in this area, both with respect to ensuring the health and safety of our personnel, but also in addressing medical issues that arise in the course of our day-to-day work across the Department of Homeland Security enterprise. I am studying this based on materials that I have been provided. I have been speaking with a number of people. My intention, so that I can assure you that this is receiving the utmost focus, is to actually speak with people across the department. I owe it to the experts who work in this area on a day-to-day basis to speak with them, to receive their assessments, to understand the arguments for and against the current structure, and to reform it accordingly, which I intend to do.
Great. What kind of organizational changes would you like to see to address the problem? I'm sure in your assessment and conversations, you've already begun to gain some information. And with those organizational changes, could you use your existing authorities, or would it require congressional action?
Congresswoman, it is my understanding that congressional action will be required because the placement of the Chief Medical Officer in the office that is known by its acronym CWMD was in fact a legislative change. The separation of the Chief Medical Officer and the office that now resides in our management directorate. But that is not to say that reforms cannot be implemented outside of the legislative construct, but it's something that I'm looking at very carefully.
Okay. And when can you provide us with a path forward?
I would expect to be able to do so in just several weeks, Congresswoman.
Thank you. Well, I look forward to working with you, sir, and my colleagues on the authorizing committee to strengthen medical coordination and oversight across the department and ensure that your entire workforce, as well as everybody in DHS custody, has consistent access to high quality care. Now, Mr. Secretary, we all know that vaccination remains a critical part of ending the COVID-19 pandemic and saving lives. For DHS, vaccinating both your workforce and your detainees is essential both for their own well-being and for the health and safety of communities across the country. And I want to start by talking about your workforce. I know you've worked hard to stand up Operation Vaccinate Our Workforce, or VOW, to rapidly increase access to vaccines. And you testified that 77% of your frontline workforce who elected to receive the vaccine have been vaccinated. Can you clarify what percentage of the entire DHS workforce is fully vaccinated?
Congresswoman, two things. Number one, by my response to your earlier question that I'll have an assessment to you within several weeks, by your expression of surprise, I clearly imposed upon myself too aggressive a timeline.
No
way! Congresswoman, we have focused so intensely on Operation VOW, Vaccinate Our Workforce, for the well-being of our frontline personnel. I don't have an answer to your specific question, and I will get that information to you as soon as I can.
Okay, excellent. And with that, Madam Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Palazzo?
Yes, Madam Chair, can you hear me this time?
Yes, we can.
Okay. All right. Well, Madam Chair, thank you. Ranking Member Fleischman, thank you. And Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here today. Listen, I just got back from the border late last night. I was down there with 12 of my colleagues. And, you know, what we're seeing and what we're hearing on the border isn't what we're really hearing from the administration or the mainstream media. There's absolutely an invasion taking place on our southern borders. Single adult men by the hundreds every night trying to break into our border. Unaccompanied children, family units are just walking up and turning themselves in. And I mean, it is, you know, there's one winner in all this. And right now it's the cartel. And the one loser is the American people. And, you know, just my understanding is families will pay thousands of dollars to have one person smuggled into America or smuggled across the Northern Triangle through Mexico. Sometimes it costs several $1,000s per state to pass. But the cartels bring them in, and just as we seen a couple of weeks ago, they'll dump children even over the border fence. And if it wasn't for our brave and committed CBP officers, those children, you know, lives and could have been in danger. But it's not just children. On my flight back last night, there was a lady who also paid smugglers to get into our country. And she had a full body cast on. They pushed her over the fence and she broke her back, where then the American people took care of her and provided for her medical services. And now she's off to whoever knows where, to her sponsors. But she wasn't alone on that flight. I mean, there were several illegals who came into our country, minors that are flying all across the United States. So effectively, Mr. Cuellar is not the only person that's practically living on the border, because we're turning all of our states into border states with our policy. So I guess real quick, what is the administration doing to stop this? Because it doesn't look like what they're doing is working. It looks like you rolled out a big welcome mat to say, send us your kids. And that is criminal. But because, you know, as long as they know that they get to our border, that we're going to take them and we're going to turn them into American citizens and let them, you know, roam free around our country, these people desperate in these countries are going to continue to take that risk, an unnecessary risk, I might add. And so please tell me what this administration is doing.
Congressman, a few things. First of all, I appreciate your recognition of the bravery of the men and women of the United States Border Patrol. Secondly, I appreciate your articulation of the cruelty of the human smuggling networks and the cartels. That is precisely why we have enhanced our efforts to tackle the activities of the smugglers, the traffickers, the cartels. We have operated, for example, we've launched Operation Sentinel in the last few weeks to build upon the work that preceded this administration. Your characterization, however, with respect to how we are addressing individuals apprehended at the border, I must respectfully disagree with from beginning to end. Individuals are expelled under Title 42 of the United States Code. Those who are not expelled are placed into immigration proceedings where they are able to make claims for relief under the laws that Congress passed. And if their claims for relief do not prevail, then they are removed from the United States. And so we continue to enforce the immigration laws. And I should say that we are improving the administrative processes in a way that has not been done before, not by the prior administration, nor administrations before then. Most notably, I should comment to ensure that the asylum system, while making sure that it follows due process requirements, is more expeditious and delivers justice with greater speed for the American public and for the migrants who are claiming humanitarian relief. And so it is not an invasion. People are not coming in without a regular order. They are being placed in immigration proceedings. They have the ability to make a claim as the law provides to an asylum officer, to an immigration judge, and the courts of the United States.
I look forward to our second round of questions, Madam Chairman. I yield back.
Mr. Quigley.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. Mr. Rutherford touched on a little bit the Uscis grants, and for those watching, those are Urban Area Security Initiative grants that assist high-threat, high-density urban areas like Chicago. They help us build and sustain the capabilities necessary to prevent, protect against, respond to, and recover from acts of terrorism, all threats, foreign and domestic. Let me ask broadly, what's your vision for Uscis? And I guess before I say that, I should thank you as well. I was pleased to hear that DHS, under your leadership, prevented some of the quick changes to the formula that were proposed previously. So I appreciate that. But as we go forward, and as we always see evolving threats, what's your vision for this? And can you talk about some of the challenges the Uscis program currently faces?
Thank you very much, Congressman. Indeed, I did put a halt to changes in the grant formula that would have redirected Urban Area Security Initiative grants in a way that, in my view and in the view of fellow experts, would not have delivered public safety and security in the most effective way to the urban areas across the United States. Those grants we have calibrated to address the most urgent priorities affecting our homeland. And so two important changes that I made was to require a certain percentage of the grant funds, 7.5% to be precise, dedicated to combating domestic violent extremism. That equates to approximately $77 million. In addition, again, to address the most urgent threats facing our homeland, I increased the minimum amount that must be dedicated to cybersecurity from 5% to 7.5%. One of the things that I am looking at very closely, Congressman, in partnership with the law enforcement community and the emergency and first responder community writ large, is whether the formulas do need to be redesigned to better deliver for the urban areas that the grant program is designed to serve. And so we are going to be engaging with stakeholders across the country to better understand their concerns with the existing formula and see what changes, if any, are suitable to meet more effectively the moment.
And you would come back to us before implementing those, I would assume, at least for some thoughts and consultation.
Most certainly, Congressman.
No, and part of this is as the threats grow, and obviously we've seen it in what you've had to address with cyber and your talk about increasing that. Others asking for this, which in the formula changes would have diluted the effort, right? Is there a need not just to reassess who needs what, but just how much we need and perhaps an overall increase given the enhanced threats, again, not just foreign as we were focused on, but clearly domestic now?
I would welcome that conversation, Congressman. I think that is a very, very important one to have.
Finally, any new tools that you're talking about with state and local leaders? And the example I hear about is updating integrated information sharing networks to improve analyzing, synthesizing, and disseminating info to prevent such attacks.
Thank you so much, Congressman. Indeed, we are engaged in discussions with our state, local, tribal, and territorial partners. One of the things which you mentioned is the provision of information to them, not only in real time, but to make sure that the information we provide is actionable for them. One of the things that we discussed, I discussed with our Office of Intelligence and Analysis, is whether that office, INA, everything seems to be known by an acronym in the federal enterprise.
Yes.
The Office of Intelligence and Analysis has the infrastructure to deliver real-time actionable information on both a secure environment and an unclassified environment. And we, with the support of this subcommittee and Congress, are building a better infrastructure for that.
We appreciate that. And my time is up, but I look forward to those communications and working with you and giving you the resources you need. Thanks again for your help. I yield back.
Ms. Henson.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairwoman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for joining us today. I appreciate this hearing, and I do wish to echo some concerns that I know several members have talked about, that we've been given more complete information on the department's budget plans in its entirety so we could look at those details more closely. But my line of questioning actually centers today on an experience we had right here in the district, Mr. Secretary. In August of 2020, a derecho storm descended on eastern Iowa and much of the Midwest. It took hours to work its way through, week-long blackouts. Some people didn't have power or internet for over a month, damage from which our communities will take literally years to recover from. According to NOAA, the August derecho is considered one of the top 10 most expensive disasters in the past 5 years at a price tag of $11 billion. One of the primary concerns that I hear from my constituents is about their interaction with FEMA's individuals and households program specifically when seeking federal disaster assistance. I'm grateful for all the work that FEMA has done for Iowans through several disasters, including this one, providing more than $11 million in individual assistance grants in response to the derecho specifically. However, I believe there is significant room for improvement at IHP, particularly when it comes to clarity and transparency with the average American who's going through this process. And so I recently wrote a letter to Administrator Criswell requesting some data on the IHP program, the acceptance rates, the appeals process to a FEMA ruling denying assistance. And in September, the GAO issued a report on the effectiveness of IHP, citing that of the 4.4 million people who applied for that assistance, only 2 million were actually found eligible and received that aid. Specifically, GAO found that FEMA needs to increase its clarity in the application process for those who need to supply more information in their applications. We saw that happening with our constituents. And in this report, GAO recommended 14 actions directly to FEMA on how to improve this program. So, Mr. Secretary, my question to you today is, can you provide a status update on the department's work to implement those recommendations from GAO?
Congresswoman, thank you very much. I'm familiar with the program. I'm familiar with the GAO report, and I will circle back with your office to provide you with the status of our actions in response to the 14 recommendations. I know that one of the primary reasons why the assistance rate is what it is because one of the thresholds that must be met is the inadequacy or the lack of insurance coverage. And in fact, people who do have insurance and who recover insurance proceeds in response to a disaster may not be eligible for the individual assistance under the FEMA grant program. I'm also very well aware of the concerns with respect to clarity and transparency in terms of the eligibility criteria and making sure the public understands what the assistance program is for and when its resources can be triggered. It's something we are very focused upon because this impacts real people in real ways. And so I would welcome the opportunity to circle back with you personally and, of course, with our respective teams so that I can deliver the specificity in response to your question that you deserve.
Yeah, and I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary, because if there's one thing that we've heard, it's that there is some challenge in going through this process. And when you think about constituents during their greatest time of need, it's when they don't have a roof over their head or they don't have that power. So we need to find a meaningful path forward here so we can best serve the people who are going through this process. You know, a lack of clarity in the application process obviously is contributing, I think, to lower acceptance rates. Do you think that if that's the case, that the agency should be working to prevent this?
Well, we have an obligation to be clear and transparent and to communicate things appropriately to the American people. And so we're taking a very serious look at this. And of course, we have an obligation to remedy any infirmities. I do want to say, though, I must champion the men and women of the Federal Emergency Management Agency. They're just extraordinary in what they do. We all have room for improvement, and that does not diminish their excellence. But the room for improvement we will use as an opportunity to be better, rest assured.
All right. I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary, and I'll reserve some follow-up questions for round two. But we appreciate FEMA's work. They helped us through a major flood in 2008, and obviously this derecho in August. So thank you, Mr. Secretary, and Madam Chair, I yield back.
I understand that the chairwoman of the full Appropriations Committee is with us, and so I will now yield to her.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I apologize to you and to Secretary Mayorkas. I'm chairing another hearing, but I did want to have the opportunity to greet the Secretary, thank him for his great work and his years of great work and public service. So, and if I can, I just want to get a question asked here, Mr. Secretary. As chair of the Labor, Health and Human Services Appropriations Committee, and we've had conversations before, I spend a significant amount of time on the Unaccompanied Children Program. And I know the Department of Health and Human Services has been in contact with you and advocates as to how we could potentially divert children from entering the Unaccompanied Children Program, in particular, discharging children to the non-parental relatives they enter the United States with. So I've heard from advocates that the number of children in the UC program who came with a non-parental relative could number in the thousands. So look, I would also note, I am not advocating for family detention, but I am looking at how we are able to discharge a grandmother and a granddaughter together as quickly as possible. So with that, can you tell me what the status is of these conversations with HHS? And are there barriers on your end to delaying the removal of these relatives so that they can serve as sponsors while the children go through their immigration court proceedings?
Madam Chairwoman, thank you so much for this important question. And I know that we discussed this previously a number of weeks ago. One of the things that we are very, very focused on is expediting, moving more efficiently in the union of the unaccompanied child with a parent, legal guardian, or qualified sponsor here in the United States. We are re-engineering that process. When a child arrives in the custody of a relative who is not a parent or legal guardian, then that child is in fact defined as an unaccompanied child, and to change that would require legislative action, I believe, to change the terms of the Trafficking Victims Protection Reauthorization Act, the TVPRA. But we are looking at processes in the meantime with respect to how we can more effectively unite an unaccompanied child with a qualified sponsor here in the United States. That is where our current focus is.
I appreciate that, and I will look into, along with my colleague, the chair of the of Homeland Subcommittee. Both of us are particularly interested in these areas, and to look at what it may be required in terms of legislative language. Your goal, as well as our goal, is to see that the children, when they are in our custody, are for the lowest length of time in custody, and that they can move to be discharged as quickly as possible. And we want to look for the ways in which, with keeping the child safe and in good hands, be able to expedite this process. We're also very, very much aware that we've had to cut back on the licensed shelters that children are in because of COVID, and we will revisit that to see with some of the new guidance and the science behind that guidance to see whether or not those at least some of those licensed beds can be used. But the issue is, and I appreciate what you said about reimagining. I mean, I think that is the right word here of what we can do to expedite discharge. We know, you know, that the longer these children are held in an emergency intake shelter, that it is so disruptive of their lives. It has, physical, repercussions. It has very serious mental and traumatic repercussions. And I know what you want to do. And what we want to do is to try to work with you to see if we can reimagine with you ways in which we move to discharge as quickly as possible, and at the same time protect the child and continue to try to protect that child with the services that he or she may need while they are in the custody of the United States, which is what we are charged with by law. I thank you for your work, and I thank you for understanding this issue and the compassion that you and the professionalism that you bring to this issue. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman.
Mr. Price.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Welcome, Ms. Secretary. I think congratulations are still in order for your early appointment and confirmation. Happy to work with you and appreciate your appearance here today. I want to pursue a line of questioning I began with the acting ICE administrator a few weeks ago. It has to do with the department's philosophy, the department's approach with respect to enforcement actions, particularly the targeting of those actions and the exercise of prosecutorial discretion. Probably aware that this has been a difficult issue over many administrations and many years. With this subcommittee, there was a particular effort 14 years ago to push for more precise and more targeted ICE enforcement, to focus on dangerous individuals who shouldn't be in the country when it came to detention and deportation. We directed funding back then with the assumption that most deportations be of such people and that they would link up with the penal system of the as people emerged actually from the system. It does raise the question of the relation to local law enforcement, which I will get to later or maybe in the next. But the result was eventually the Secure Communities program in the Bush administration. And as you, I'm sure, also know, that program turned out to be controversial, pretty difficult, mainly because it was much less targeted, much less discriminating, as had hoped, much less focused on dangerous individuals. So during the Obama administration, there was discussion, agitation about the blanket policy of secure communities and the establishment of the Priority Enforcement Program, PEP, during the Obama administration. That program came a way of achieving greater targeting, greater prioritization of individuals for enforcement. Unfortunately, the Secure Communities program was brought back with a vengeance by the Trump administration, bringing back a much more capricious targeting strategy, swept up non-threatening individuals all posed a threat. I quoted some figures from the Syracuse University program that tracks these things. Number of people in ICE detention rose from 41,163 in 2016 to 49,319. At the same time, the number of individuals who had serious level 1 criminal records declined, 7,475 in 2016 to 2019. Percentage of those detained with no criminal record at all rose 57 to 64%. In other words, ICE raids became both more frequent and less discriminating. I saw this in my district, the impact of more raids and a more random quality to those raids, and a lot of anxiety and fear in the community as a result. Can you, given this framework, can you tell us where this administration intends to go?
Thank you very much, Congressman. When I was a federal prosecutor in the United States Attorney's Office, we had approximately 186 assistant United States attorneys who enforced federal criminal law. And we dealt with drug trafficking, business crimes, public corruption, Federal Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, cyber crime, the whole panoply of crimes. And 186 criminal prosecutors could not address every single federal crime that occurred in a jurisdiction that was populated by 18 million people. And therefore, we set forth guidelines that guided our use of resources to bring to bear the greatest impact for the safety of the people in the Central District of California. That approach is mirrored across prosecution offices from coast to coast and border to border. That is no different than what we are endeavoring to do here in the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. How can our resources be dedicated in the enforcement of federal immigration law to deliver in the enforcement arena the greatest public safety impact? And so we are not pursuing cases indiscriminately. We are not pursuing them devoid of factors that educate and inform the administration of criminal justice or civil immigration justice, but we are doing so by looking at what poses the greatest threat, what resources do we have, and what delivers the best outcome for the American people. And that is what we are doing.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Aguilar.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I wanted to follow up briefly on the line of questioning that my colleague Ms. Underwood talked about. You know, given the kind of Byzantine nature of the DHS, medical officer perspective, I wanted to ask what role that individual, DHS's chief medical officer, will play in establishing guidelines to safely process individuals at the southern border as we lead into as we look toward a post-Title 42 world.
Thank you, Congressman. The Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Pritesh Gandhi, and one of his colleagues, Dr. Alex Eastman, and their team have done extraordinary work, not only on the border, but quite frankly, with the workforce in tandem with other colleagues in delivering on Operation VOW that was referenced earlier, vaccinate our workforce. They have built and they have designed and built an architecture across the southern border to ensure, in partnership with state and local authorities, community-based organizations, with the Mexican government, the testing, isolation, and quarantine as needed of individuals who are apprehended and placed in immigration proceedings. They've done an extraordinary job, and I would be quite privileged to provide the details to you and your team.
Sure, but I guess the question is, what role specific to Title 42 will they continue will you continue to follow their guidance and follow their lead when it comes to the conditions and the processing of individuals in a post Title 42 world, and establishing those guidelines to process individuals who present themselves for lawful asylum?
So we, our chief medical officer, our experts elsewhere in the department are connected with the CDC, and we communicate with respect to the data, the science, what the public health imperative requires, both with respect to the situation now in a Title 42 environment, as well as planning for what will occur when the use of Title 42 is no longer needed because the public health imperative no longer requires it. I hope I'm answering your question, but they are integrally involved in the planning and execution of those plans to ensure, on the one hand, the public health of the American people, and on the other hand, the health of the migrants themselves.
I appreciate that. I wanted to talk briefly about detention facilities. I've heard since I've been in Congress, I've heard from immigrants and individuals in detention, advocates, about the mistreatment within detention centers across the country. And I was pleased to see DHS chose to close the Carrillo Immigration Detention Center and is preparing to close the Irwin County Detention Center. These closures are one step closer to ensuring that we treat individuals in our custody with dignity and respect. Now, as DHS continues a review of the detention facilities across the country, can we expect to see the closure of additional detention facilities, including family detention facilities?
Congressman, we are studying the issue very carefully. My direction could not have been clearer, which is that we will not tolerate the mistreatment of individuals in detention or substandard conditions. And we will take whatever actions are needed to ensure that that directive is honored across the board.
I appreciate that. And specific to the budget, ahead of this week's budget release, can we expect to see a decrease in immigration detention funding in exchange for support of safer ATD programs?
Congressman, one of the things that I have observed is the detention of individuals that do not pose a threat to public safety or do not pose a risk of flight such that we are not confident in their appearance in future immigration proceedings. I am concerned about the overuse of detention and where alternatives to detention, ATD, would suffice, and ensuring the integrity of the immigration system. And we will indeed be looking at that and executing accordingly.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Yield back, Madam Chair.
That completes the first round, so we will be going into a second round. Mr. Secretary, before I go on to my questions with regards to family extension, I just want to point out one other thing with regards to the article that was referenced in the Washington Post. It also states that ICE agents arrested 645 people who matched the administration's new priorities in March, and then more than doubled that number in April to 1,552,000, and that the data shows that it is the individuals with the highest level of criminality that are now being targeted, which is really the intent in terms of being sure that the American people are safe by targeting those with the highest criminal and the most dangerous in our country. So I just wanted to reference that the other part of the article that talked about who exactly was being targeted. Mr. Secretary, to help free up space in overcrowded CBP holding facilities, ICE recently began using its 2 large family detention centers as family staging centers, or FSCs, where migrant families are held for up to 72 hours while being processed. ICE has also begun using several hotels as emergency family staging centers, or EFSCs. How are decisions made about whether to release families directly from CBP custody or to transfer them to ICE FSCs or EFSCs for processing?
Madam Chairwoman, if I can make one comment, I appreciate your citation to other data that was captured in the Washington Post article. The one data that your colleague, the congressman, cited as a data point with which I'm unfamiliar, and I will drill down on that. The article makes a very, very important point, and it is that article's foundational point, which is that the resources of Immigration and Customs Enforcement are going to be dedicated to the greatest impact on behalf of the American people. We will not be enforcing law indiscriminately, misusing resources that don't deliver quality for the investment of resources. With respect to the ICE facilities, the reason that we are employing those facilities in the way that we are is because of the fact that we are indeed still addressing the COVID-19 pandemic imperative. And we need facilities to test and, importantly, isolate and quarantine family unit members as the science requires. And so we have transformed those facilities, and we are using the hotels for that purpose. And if and when, for example, local facilities or community-based organizations that could provide similar services are inadequate. So what we have done is we've built an architecture to ensure the appropriate and required testing, isolation, and quarantine of family unit members whom we are unable to expel under Title 42.
The use of hotels has received some criticism. What was the process for awarding this contract for managing the EFSCs, and what are your plans for that contract going forward? And what are your plans more broadly for family detention in the future?
Madam Chairwoman, I am not familiar with the particulars of the contract and how that was arranged. It is not appropriate for me to be involved in the specific advertising and selection of contractors, but I know that has received questions and is the subject of a review by the Office of Inspector General.
Okay. Our understanding is that these facilities have not been used to their full capacity, even though the Border Patrol has continued to release families directly from their custody to prevent overcrowding. Can you describe what changes will be made as a result of the CBP ICE coordination cell that was recently established?
Madam Chairwoman, that coordination cell is but one coordination cell, because we also have a transportation coordination cell that speaks to the partnership not only across the Department of Homeland Security enterprise, but across all of government enterprise that is addressing the migration of unaccompanied children to our southern border, and both bringing greater efficiency to the processes that we currently have, as well as re-engineering the processes. So that coordination cell of which you speak specifically is designed to take a look at the influx of unaccompanied children and family members whom we are unable to expel under Title 42 because of limited capacity in Mexico to receive them, to understand the available resources we have here along the border for the testing, isolation, and quarantine as needed of the individuals, and to make sure that those resources are being utilized efficiently and effectively, and including most cost effectively.
Okay. Just one quick final question on this. When migrants are being released from either ICE or CBP custody, are they being enrolled into alternatives to detention and offered ICE-funded case management services, such as legal orientation programs and trauma counseling?
They are, and that is our objective, Madam Chairwoman. They are in immigration proceedings. They receive a notice to appear either at the border or at an ICE facility. They're placed in immigration proceedings, and we are working to build a better infrastructure in partnership with community-based organizations to provide them with legal process and guidance along the way. It is the data demonstrates quite powerfully that individuals who are guided in the process, who receive information and access to counsel, have a far higher appearance rate in immigration proceedings than those who don't.
Mr. Fleischman.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, I appreciate the questions of folks on both sides of the dais. Let me just say this. While I applaud ICE for going after some very dangerous criminals in this country that are posing threats, the Biden administration, and I'm adamant about this, is doing nothing to disincentivize the wave of migrants coming in that are just pouring in and overwhelming the entire system, including ICE. So you're forced to pick and choose. If we kept illegal immigration at a minimum, we would not have the system overrun at all levels. And with that, Mr. Secretary, you were once the head of USCIS, so you know what is involved in applying for citizenship and asylum, sir. It is a commitment, and there is a defined process spelled out in statute. Do you think it's fair that migrants who cease participating in the legal processes related to their immigration status be allowed to remain in this country? I'm talking about people who knowingly fail to show up for their court hearings and are no longer checking in with their local ICE offices. If so, why, sir? And a follow-up to that, do you think that migrants who have been issued final orders of removal by courts in this nation should be allowed to stay in this country? If so, why, sir?
Mr. Ranking Member, let me first express my disagreement with your statement that this administration and this department is doing nothing to disincentivize people from irregular migration. And let me just cite two examples, if I may. First, we have engaged in robust communication, not only along the migratory path, but in the countries of origin in the Northern Triangle, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, to seek to persuade individuals from taking the perilous journey north. Secondly, we are investing in addressing the root causes of migration so that individuals do not feel compelled to leave their homes out of desperation, combating extraordinary violence and poverty. And thirdly, we're building legal pathways so that individuals do not need to take the perilous journey and can, in the countries of origin, avail themselves of refugee processing, Central American Minors Program, and other pathways that apply the laws of the United States to their claims of eligibility so that they can avail themselves of a safe, orderly, and humane immigration system that was the intent of Congress. We, as I articulated at the very outset of this hearing and throughout the questioning, Mr. Ranking Member, do apply the laws of the United States, will continue to apply the laws of the United States, and we will do so to maximum effect for the benefit of the American public as Congress intended. The fact of the matter is that we cannot, with the resources that we have, address the fact that we have over 11 million undocumented individuals in the United States. And we all are in agreement, although there is so much disagreement about immigration policy, and it is so polarizing, there is unanimity that the system is broken is in need of reform. And it is my sincere hope, and I'm working very hard to achieve legislative immigration reform. That is fundamentally the answer. And until that is achieved, and I hope that is very, very soon, we will enforce the laws to ensure the best outcome and most effective outcome for the American people.
Mr. Secretary, I thank you for your articulate and thorough answers to this. Obviously, there are some broad areas of disagreements between us on these key issues, but I do agree that the system is broken, is overwhelmed, and these issues need to be addressed. And I do commit to work on behalf of my constituents and the American people, as I know you will, to come to some type of a solution in this regard. But thank you for your service. Thank you for your testimony today. And Madam Chair, I will yield back.
Mr. Cuellar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, last time we spoke, we left out that we're supposed to get together. So hopefully sometime soon we can catch up. Last night, Mr. Secretary, the EMC, Guillermo heard from the city of Laredo, and the Laredo Health Director, Richard Chamberlain, told me that the city of Laredo has been aiding NGOs throughout the past couple of months, but they noticed that their initial volume that they're getting from the Valley has now increased from 50 persons a day. Now they're getting 250 to 350 people a day from the Valley or from the Del Rio area. Laredo has 2 shelters, NGOs, that have been helping with food and shelter and health assessments. But the directors from Laredo, they're getting a little concerned because what they're saying is that about 6 out of 100 people that are coming in every day are testing COVID-19 positive. That is the migrants or the asylum seekers. And then the other issue is that when the shelters are full, because there's only 2 shelters in Laredo, Border Patrol is offloading them directly at bus stations or at the airport. And as I mentioned, every time I fly from Laredo to DC to do my work, I see folks there. So this is not my words. This is health directors in Laredo. They're saying that they're worried about U.S. citizens being exposed to infectious disease threats. And keep in mind the frustration that the border, non-essential, are closed, but they're seeing literally thousands of people every week being brought down from the Valley where I'm at right now. So my question is, what can you do to help, number one, and what do I tell the city of Laredo? And the second part has to do is, what do I tell the Stark County Sheriff, Rene Fuentes? What do I tell the Zapata Sheriff, Raimundo Bosque, or the Webb County Sheriff, Martin Cuellar, which is my brother, or Claudio Trevino, the Laredo Police Chief, or the LaSalle Sheriff, Anthony Sartucci, or the McMullen, Emmett Shelton, where they're now seeing increases of criminal activity. And this is from the sheriffs. This is not me saying this. And they're seeing stash houses growing. They're seeing this illegal activity. So instead of the regular work that they're doing, they're now focusing on this immigration-related activity. I know that we increased Stone Garden, and I was hoping with that monies that I fought to increase, it would go down to South Texas, but President Trump sent it off a lot of it to Florida, and I hope it comes back to the southwest border. And I also like to follow up with you on the $1.3 billion that was appropriated for the border wall in the Laredo sector, which I fought against President Trump. And now that that money's there, and we'll wait for the budget, Now they want to take it out when there were security requirements in the Laredo sector. Now they want to take that money out. And I'm glad that the wall is not going to be done. But my question is, what do I tell the city of Laredo? What do I tell the border communities on Roma, Texas, where I'm at? What do I tell all the sheriffs about the facts that I just mentioned? These are not my words. These are words directly from them. So we need your help on this.
Congressman, quite a number of questions, and I have quite a number of answers. Perhaps it would be best for me to speak with you directly so I don't consume the remaining time, but let me just answer as succinctly as I can. In 1989, I started as a federal prosecutor on September 25th, 1989. In 1989, 1990, 1991, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 2000, and 2001. I left in April of 2001. On the border, there were the challenges of stash houses. And so the work on the border is dynamic, evolving, and there are threads of consistency for years and years. And so I want to make sure that the American public understands that the challenges that our noble and brave law enforcement officers face on the border are by no means new. And the threat of trafficking and the threat that the cartels pose and the threat of criminality is nothing new or specific to the border. Quite frankly, as we know all too well, and when we look at the homicide rates across the country over the all too many years. I look forward to engaging with the border sheriffs and the border chiefs. I have a periodic meeting with law enforcement on precisely this issue, and I would look forward to hearing from them and addressing their needs and the solutions that we can deliver. Operation Sentinel is one of them, and enhanced law enforcement in a task force model is a stark example. I also would be very pleased to speak with the officials in Laredo because we do have an architecture for the movement of individuals, which also is not specific to this particular time, but is something that we have employed over the many years of addressing irregular migration at our southern border, and the architecture we have for the testing, isolation, and quarantine of individuals. And so I would welcome the opportunity to speak directly with the officials whom you reference, and of course with you in a one-on-one to delve further into these important issues.
Mr. Palazzo.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, listen, you got a huge job and a huge responsibility. The Department of Homeland Security, you're over a huge amount of agencies, but number one priority that you have and that we have as members of Congress is to keep America safe. And so, although we may disagree on some adjectives and some language, I do still think that we do have if it's not an invasion, we definitely have a huge crisis on our southern border. Just ask the people under your command, and I think they would agree with me. But you know, we also want to work with you. Like, this committee wants to work for the common good of the American people, and we got to strive towards more bipartisan legislation. And not by bipartisan, I don't mean just having one Democrat sign on to Republicans or one Republican sign on Democrat, but we need to try to get more to super majorities, because if we pass legislation, whether it's your immigration reform, which people want to talk about, but it needs to be bipartisan, because if it's bipartisan in a true fashion, it'll be good for the majority of Americans. You mentioned you use Title 42 to expel, those who are here illegally and should not be in our country. But you also said, well, once the pandemic's over, you're going to get rid of Title 42. What are you going to use then to expel immigrants that are coming over to America? Please keep your remarks brief.
Congressman, thank you for your remarks before your question, and thank you for the question. Title 42 is a public health authority of the CDC. and it requires a public health determination of need. And it is not a tool of immigration enforcement by law. It is not a tool to monitor or to control flows of people as a matter of immigration policy. It is a public health law. So the data, from a public health perspective, the public health data has to support its use. And when that Title 42 authority is no longer available, we will use immigration law, continue to use immigration law and the other resources that we have available to address irregular migration, just as we have in the past.
I do appreciate that. I do appreciate that. I just know that the Border Patrol agents, they really want to keep some form of Title 42 in place, or the migrant protection protocols we're working. Their fear is they're going to become overwhelmed once again. Also, listen, we're fair people. We believe that, there's several things. We've been to the border. You need more resources on the border, right? You need more boots because they're stretched to the max. We need technology. Technology works, and we need the best technology ever. But we also need barriers. Barriers work. You cannot deny barriers don't work. We wrapped ourselves in the Capitol with 2 barriers to keep people out. And so, is there any intention on finishing the fence? And also, there was fence that was actually destroyed, that was already there to be replaced with the new bollard fencing. Can we at least not replace the fence that we tore down? Because it's requiring much more resources to patrol and secure our southern border.
Congressman, we are studying the issues of parts of the wall that has been there for years, that is no longer sustainable, and whether that can be or should be rebuilt. We are looking at some of the very issues that you have identified, and I look forward to circling back with you to discuss our assessments.
Right, and so using the immigration laws that you just mentioned, and once Title 42 goes away, wouldn't it be better if we could adjudicate these claims on our border faster instead of releasing them into our interior? For many of them, that if they don't have a credible asylum claim, they're not going to show up. They're going to disappear and add to that undocumented number. Judges would help, right? If we could adjudicate on the spot, on the border, we need more judges or other resources. Can you please tell us what you need to do your job? And we want to help you to do that.
Thank you so much, Congressman. This is an area where I too will circle back with you, because we are indeed taking a look at the fact that it is multiple years between the time of apprehension and final adjudication of an asylum claim. That is too long a period of time. What can we do to improve the process to deliver an outcome more rapidly, which speaks to the efficiency, an orderly immigration system, and quite frankly, delivers justice for the applicants themselves more rapidly? This is something that has not been tackled successfully in the past, and we will tackle it now. It's something that we are looking at, both with respect to the administration of the asylum laws, the credible fear determinations, who can make them, how quickly can we reach a final adjudication, and what are the needs of the immigration court system. We are taking a very close look at that in partnership with the Department of Justice.
Ms. Underwood.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, when you share the percentage of your workforce that's been vaccinated, can you break that down by component?
I would be very happy to provide that data to you, Congresswoman. I don't have it at my fingertips. I apologize.
Yep, no problem. So now that we've successfully gotten the vaccine supply up, we have to focus on vaccinating every frontline worker, increasing vaccine confidence, and combating disinformation. How has vaccine hesitancy impacted your effort to vaccinate DHS personnel? And what proactive steps are you taking to increase vaccine confidence and ensure your employees have accurate information about not only the safety and efficacy of the COVID-19 vaccines, but also the critical importance of vaccination to America's national security?
We have invested so mightily, not just resources, but individual energy in Operation VOW, vaccinate our workforce, not only to ensure that those who are willing to be vaccinated have the vaccine available and accessible and can receive it. And indeed, the number of personnel has increased dramatically as a part of Operation VOW, but to also inform and educate and persuade those personnel who are hesitant to receive the vaccine to, in fact, be vaccinated. That's an ongoing effort. It's an effort of education, information, persuasion, and accommodation.
Great. Thank you. Turning to detainees, I understand that DHS is currently reevaluating its vaccination strategy for migrants in custody. What can you tell us about your plans to improve access to vaccination for your detainees, and how soon do you expect to be able to offer the COVID-19 vaccines for every individual in your custody?
That is something that we are looking at very carefully, Congresswoman. I spoke with our chief medical officer earlier this week about this very subject. That is under review, and I will provide your office with a timetable.
And do you believe that better coordination of medical care across the department would facilitate further improvements in this kind of vaccination effort and medical operations in general?
Congresswoman, I have not found coordination of resources in our department to be an obstacle with respect to this particular issue.
Thank you. Vaccination for both DHS staff and detainees is essential not only for the health of both groups, but also for preventing community spread and protecting all Americans. Please do keep our office updated on your efforts to accelerate this process. Now I'd like to switch gears and talk about a major threat to our homeland and a top concern for many of my constituents: domestic terrorism and domestic violent extremism. In fact, I'd like to read part of a message that I received last summer from a mother in my district. Quote, "There is a militia cell in Antioch that is becoming more and more emboldened to take the law into their own hands. I'm becoming fearful to send my children to the same schools as white supremacist militia members." End quote. Unfortunately, the federal agencies whose job it is to track and respond to threats of violent extremism were caught flat-footed when a horde of white supremacists and other domestic extremists invaded the Capitol. ABC News reported that in the months leading up to the January 6th insurrection, the DHS Office of Intelligence and Analysis had been practically dismantled after it was revealed that under the Trump administration, it had inappropriately targeted journalists reporting on the excessive use of force by federal agents in Oregon. Mr. Secretary, I know that you weren't in charge during these events, but since being confirmed, what steps have you taken and what future plans do you have to repair the department's operations so that it can provide essential intelligence on real threats like the Capitol insurrection?
I am, Congresswoman, I'm very proud of the men and women of the Office of Intelligence and Analysis. We have prioritized the dissemination of real-time actionable information to our state, local, tribal, territorial partners. We are committed to doing so in an apolitical way, guided only by the Homeland Security imperative. And in fact, I penned earlier this week a message to the men and women of the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, underscoring the apolitical nature of our work and expressing my gratitude for their commitment to our values and principles, as well as our underlying mission.
Now, Mr. Secretary, that's a policy change that I appreciate, but my question was about operational changes. Can you detail any operational changes over at Intelligence and Analysis?
So we are looking, I'm sorry if I didn't answer your question fulsomely at first. We're looking at the very different products that we can disseminate to our partners in the community. We issued a National Terrorism Advisory System bulletin in January. We renewed it, but within the past 2 weeks, we have issued information bulletins. We very well may issue an additional information bulletin based on the threat landscape today. We are invested in the infrastructure to more effectively disseminate information to local communities, to deliver the technological changes that are needed to more effectively accomplish that. We also have renamed an office, the Center for Prevention Programs and Partnerships, to more ably equip local communities to more effectively work in partnership with them to address the threat of domestic terrorism. And we're looking at our grant programs and how we can both strengthen them and develop innovative communication tools to inform the American public on how to detect the evolving threat, how to report concerns, and how to prevent, respond, and be resilient to them.
Thank you. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Ms. Henson.
And thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you again, Mr. Secretary, for sticking around for round 2 of questions. I actually wanted to call your attention to another communication issue within your department, and I hope we can work together to resolve this specifically. This subcommittee has already heard from ICE and Customs and Border Patrol this year, and there was a common thread that stuck out to me in those conversations that the agencies didn't seem to be effectively communicating on immigration issues. And while they share, obviously, this common goal of keeping Americans safe and protecting our border, they don't seem to be sharing the information. And it's vitally important when we're trying to manage this crisis at the border, track illegal immigrants who have been caught and then released into the homeland, and then arrest and deport those who have chosen not to follow our laws or pose a risk to public safety, as we were discussing earlier in this hearing. So do you agree, Mr. Secretary, that ICE and CBP should be sharing that data and information specifically when it comes to tracking illegal immigrants?
Oh, absolutely. And I speak regularly together with Troy Miller of Customs and Border Protection, Tay Johnson of Immigration and Customs Enforcement, multiple times a week. And so I would be very eager to and interested in receiving the details with respect to the communication concerns that you reference, Congresswoman.
Yeah, and Mr. Secretary, the CBP should be conveying that information to ICE. ICE should be in some way tracking that individual or family unit and whether or not the NTA is met. And what Director Johnson told us just a few weeks ago was that that is not happening once they are out of CBP custody. So do you believe that your department at any time should be able to actually identify an illegal immigrant in this country who the department has processed and released into this country?
I'm not sure I understand your question, Congresswoman.
Do you think that once they're in the country and we've gone through this process, that we should be able to know where they are? We should be able to track them if they're in this country illegally.
To know and track more than 11 million undocumented individuals in the United States?
We have no idea, Mr. Secretary, and this was a direct response to one of our earlier questions, how many are specifically in Iowa. Once they come across that border and they're out of CBP custody, we've been informed there is no way to track these individuals unless they actually show up for that NTA hearing, which we know sometimes they do not. So do you believe that we should be able to?
I'm not sure I agree with the premise of your question, Congresswoman. When an individual is placed into immigration proceedings, they are placed into immigration proceedings through a notice to appear. When they are properly informed of the hearing date, time, and location, they have appropriate information. They have assistance of counsel. The appearance rate is extraordinarily high. I am not aware of the fact that we have the tools, resources, and capabilities to track with the more than 11 million unlawfully present individuals in the United States, which speaks to the fundamental broken system and the need for immigration reform.
And I'm
So
speaking,
many of
Mr. Secretary, specifically to the people who have been through CBP and processed and then released into the homeland, not the ones who made it across the border and are in this country illegally that we maybe didn't go through that process. I think the point I'd like to make, Mr. Secretary, is I would ask the administration to seriously look at this. I stand ready to look at the resources necessary to make sure these departments can actually talk to each other and communicate to each other. This is a safety and security issue if we can't exactly know how many immigrants are coming to a state like Iowa. When we're looking at over 1 million, possibly, as we've heard this number keep going up this year, that's highly concerning to me. And I would ask you seriously look at policies that we can make sure these departments can track these individuals once they're in the country illegally, even if they do have that NTA. We know that sometimes they don't appear, and that is a safety and security issue.
Let me, if I can, Congresswoman, I really welcome the opportunity to speak with you about this because I'm not sure we have a common understanding of the problem that you've identified. Because if we have a common understanding of the problem, I assure you that we have a solution. Because what we do is we place individuals in immigration proceedings. And an individual who is a recent border crosser who does not appear in immigration proceedings is a priority for enforcement action under the guidelines that were issued on January 20th and revised on February 8th.
All right. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I'll have some questions for follow-up as well. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Mr. Price.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, I want to acknowledge your forthright response earlier on the question of the targeting of ICE enforcement actions. Of course, the question of enforcement discretion, the discretion that you exercise, that also raises the question about how well targeted is the work you do with other law enforcement agencies. So that's what I want to turn to now. As you know, the 287G program in particular greatly was increased by the last administration from 30 to 150 participating jurisdictions. The way the 287G program works or doesn't work has been at the center of these discussions about discretion. Are you talking about dangerous people at the point they're released from the penal system? Or are you talking about people picked up for minor offenses? Or are you talking even about local law enforcement being commandeered to take proactive actions, which often it is argued, compromises their local community policing role? Then there's the weaponizing of 287G. This was of great concern. For example, the Atlanta director of ICE at one point in the last administration acknowledged that the targeting of immigration raids, of ICE raids, was it was targeted at jurisdictions where the local sheriffs had chosen to withdraw from these voluntary 287G agreements. There were provocative billboards even purchased by ICE across the state in areas where 287G agreements were being ended. So I want to register my hope and my expectation that in this new administration, we're going to see some serious changes. We're going to see a renewed focus on targeted enforcement, and we're going to see the reform, if not the elimination of 287G. And that leads to my question. Could you describe where the administration is in the process of 287G program? If the administration will be ending some of the agreements possibly made in the last 4 years, or has the program perhaps outlived its usefulness? What do you see as the future of that program? And then that does raise the further question of what is the appropriate relationship to local law enforcement?
Congressman,
identifying people who are truly dangerous clearly could be a matter of working with local law enforcement, and so If not some of these flawed programs, then what would you look for in those relationships?
Congressman, I am certainly aware of the abuses of the 287G program, and I believe that I brought an example of that abuse to an end recently. We're focused on smart and effective law enforcement. And in that regard, I am engaging with the men and women of ICE in the development of Secretary's enforcement guidelines. And once we have done that, I do intend to continue my dialogue with sheriffs and chiefs of police across the country to see how we can most effectively partner in the service of the new architecture of smart and effective law enforcement. And I do believe that they have a vital role to play, such that when an individual who indeed poses a very significant public safety threat is in local custody and is about to be released, that individual is not released into the immigrant community whom that individual will victimize, but that we can bring our resources to bear for the protection of the public. And so I do think that we can achieve a valuable partnership that addresses and ends the pernicious practices of the past and serves a more intelligent and effective law enforcement goal.
I do think that's an important enterprise, and I'm glad to hear you're engaged in it. There is a good deal of confusion, I think, and uncertainty about what that relationship would look like, and so it is important, I think, to proceed to firm that up and make these expectations clear. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Mr. Aguilar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Secretary, I wanted to continue down the line of detention and specifically talk about the Office of Detention Ombudsman, which was a product of the Chairwoman's leadership and the work of this committee. This office reports directly to you and has access to inspect and conduct oversight of all detention facilities and can assist individuals who report mistreatment or abuse in DHS detention facilities. What's the status of the office and its operations? And can you describe your interaction with this office since you've been secretary?
Thank you very much. And I very much appreciate Congress's support in creating the Office of the Detention Ombudsman. I have met with the leadership of that office. I know that the office leaders have traveled to the border and have visited facilities in the interior. We've discussed the focus of their work and how to most effectively prioritize that work. And right now our thinking is to really address casework, to in fact address complaints and concerns about mistreatment and conditions brought by individuals in detention, community-based organizations, and tackling the challenges that those complaints surface. So we have been in touch. And of course, I have also been in close touch with the Office for Civil Rights and Civil Liberties that has jurisdiction and responsibilities itself that are intertwined with those of the Office of the Detention Ombudsman to make sure that we can most cohesively bring the different resources to bear.
So if members of Congress understand one thing, it's casework. And so, given that fact is, will there be metrics associated with it? Will you be, making public number of cases open, number of cases closed, open cases, average length of a case? Will you be making those metrics available?
Congressman, I have not actually looked at what metrics we will develop and publish. It's a very important question, and I will act on that immediately.
I appreciate it, Mr. Secretary. And I'll just go briefly to USCIS. I'm concerned about the ongoing and growing backlog, which has ballooned to over 3 million cases. I understand that the pandemic has obviously made it more difficult for caseworkers to process as offices were closed and unable to conduct interviews. Given your background with your previous role as director of USCIS, can you share your plans in reducing the backlog in the upcoming fiscal year?
Congressman, this is something that we have studied very carefully. You will see in the president's fiscal year 2022 budget a request for an appropriation of approximately $345 million to U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services for a number of objectives, one of which is indeed to address the backlog. It is also that time when U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services is considering a new fee rule to address the cost structure that guides its adjudications, the fees it receives. We're in dialogue about that. We're very, very focused on the backlog and know the obstacle it creates for those who are seeking access to our legal immigration system.
I appreciate it. I'll yield back, Madam Chair. Thanks, Mr. Secretary.
I believe that completes the second round, and I have had a request from some members for a third round. So we will go into a third round. The request of Ms. Henson, Ms. Palazzo, Ms. Underwood have made that request. Are there any other members who would like to participate in the third round at this time? Please let us know. And Mr. Cuellar. Okay. Mr. Secretary, TSA Administrator Pekoski has talked about the relatively low level of compensation for transportation security officers. He believes that it's not commensurate with the training, technical skill, and responsibilities of the job, and that it contributes to chronic recruitment and retention challenges. Do you believe that migrating the TSA workforce to a GS pay system would alleviate some of those hiring retention challenges?
Madam Chairwoman, I do, and that is something that we are studying right now.
Okay. Since the creation of DHS, employee morale has consistently ranked among the worst in federal government. And this is based on the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey conducted yearly by the Office of Personnel Management. Each administration has tried to address this issue, but the problem persists. What are your plans for improving morale within the department?
Madam Chairwoman, I'm incredibly proud of the men and women of the Department of Homeland Security. I am very invested in their well-being, their sense of fulfillment, their dedication to mission, and the opportunities that they have before them to realize their greatest hopes and highest aspirations. I have collected information with respect to all of the efforts across the department to invest in our workforce. I have studied those efforts, and I am developing plans to enhance and strengthen them.
Mr. Palazzo.
Okay. Oh, thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Secretary, thank you for hanging out with us to answer our questions for a third round. So during my trip to El Paso, we went by Fort Bliss, and we actually visited the emergency intake site. Very impressive how it was, built so fast. I think it's going to help provide some of that compassion that we expect to address the humanitarian crisis at the border. But the one thing they could not answer is they could not answer what is it costing the American taxpayers. And as appropriators, I thought there was two appropriators in the border trip. They couldn't answer it. So if you could you please provide to myself and perhaps the committee, if they're interested, the actual daily, monthly cost of the emergency intake site?
I most certainly will. That information is in the possession of the Department of Health and Human Services. The emergency intake sites are operated by HHS, but I certainly will. We work in an all-of-government effort to address the needs at the southern border. So I will speak with our partners and get that information to you, Congressman.
Thank you. And yes, it's under Health and Human Services. I appreciate that. Also, this is really under your jurisdiction, but I think for the committee's benefit, they should know that we tried to visit the El Paso Intelligence Center. So important to see what's going on, to get a good idea of what's really taking place at the border, from the smuggling. Listen, we know the drugs are off the charts. The fentanyl is already 6,000 pounds of fentanyl in the first 5 months of the year. Cocaine, hard narcotics. I mean, as our Border Patrol agents and the awesome job that they're doing, as they're misdirected and redirected to meet this crisis at the border, the humanitarian crisis, that we're just allowing who knows what. Like someone mentioned, like, I mean, the gotaways, the people are coming across, we don't know their nationality. We don't know what their intent is. And we don't know how much drugs. I mean, there's sex offenders. Already 265 sex offenders have been apprehended this year alone that we know of. Murderers, criminals, and so that's why I support the boots on the ground, the technology, and they really need technology. They can, with the limited resources that they have, they can redirect their precious resources to the criminal activity if they have better technology and more technology. And of course, barriers work. I just cannot understand why we don't have more fencing, or at least replace the fencing that we have. Real quick, listen, I know, again, you have a big agency. There's so many things we want to talk about. There's more other borders as well. There's a maritime border, which is so important to me and many of us who live amongst the coastal regions of our nation. And I just got to tell you, the Coast Guard is under your purview, and they do an awesome job. The national security cutters, they're smuggling drugs across our border. We understand that, but your men and women in the Coast Guard, or America's men and women in the Coast Guard, they're doing a heck of a job. And they have multi missions. But I just want to let you know, we think it's a great investment. With limited resources that we have to support the Coast Guard's cutter replacement program. It's desperately needed. And I know that someone mentioned the Jones Act earlier. That is extremely important to protecting America's industrial maritime base. And I hope you will continue to support that with the administration, maybe be a voice when others truly don't understand how important the Jones Act is. And if you can, I know I have a lot more stuff to talk about. And if we could do, Madam Chair, we need to start doing congressional oversight and going on CODELs. And I would love to, make them more bipartisan. I know we weren't able to get any of our colleagues across the aisle to join us on that 12-member border trip, but I think it's really important for not one party or the other to do it on their own, but to do it together. And so with that, I'll be respectful of the Secretary's time and my colleagues, and I yield back.
As soon as restrictions are lifted, we will be doing some traveling.
Okay, I understand.
Mr. Cuellar.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Mr. Secretary, you've been more than generous on your time going a third round with us. First of all, I want to say thank you for filling up those gaps at that border levee in South Texas in my district. And thank you so much for working with the Army Corps on doing that, especially with hurricane season around the corner, number one. Number two, I like to follow up with you when we get together on what you plan to do on some of those gaps there on the fence. I'd like to talk to you about that. But the other thing I want to talk to you about is, when the president, and I want to thank President Biden for putting that order to stop the building of the fence itself. But there were, the Army Corps did its job, you did your job, but the Department of Justice still has some lawsuits that are going on, and I would like to see if there's any way you can talk to the Attorney General, because there's some people that are still afraid that they're going to be losing their lands. They still have lawsuits, several of them down here in the valley. So I'd like to follow up with you on those lawsuits, because pretty much everything has stopped except some of those lawsuits. And I'd like to get your assistance on that part. And with that, I just want to say thank you. You've been more than generous with your time. I look forward to sitting down with you again in person when we open up on that.
Thank you, Congressman.
Madam Chair, well, she's not there, so I'll. I just. Well, I'm the last chair. So I guess if she's okay with that, I'll yield back the balance of the time. And Madam Chair, I yield back the balance of the time. And thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Ms. Henson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you again, Mr. Secretary. I wanted to go back to some comments that you made about the immigration process being broken, and that's something that I think we can all agree on. I did 3 public town halls yesterday in my district, and I want to echo that I heard that from many people as we were having discussions about the border, that we need to talk about immigration reform as well. Our process is onerous. It's expensive for people to go through, and it incentivizes illegal immigration as a result. So it is broken and we need to fix it. But I think one of the ways we start to tackle this problem to fix it is to ensure that we can effectively manage what is happening at the border. And as I learned, I went down to the Del Rio sector and visited with the CPP down there at Eagle Pass. And the local sheriffs and the law enforcement there are fighting those cartels every day. We heard it direct out of the mouth of one of my constituents yesterday. The cartels are evil people and we can't let them win. So I just want to go back really quickly to what you said in response to the ranking member's question about your administration, the administration's work on disincentives to illegal immigration. But at the most basic level, wouldn't the best disincentive to be that it won't work? It won't be successful when you come across the border. It won't be profitable for the cartels and the coyotes and the human traffickers. Wouldn't the best way to stop illegal immigration be to stop illegal immigrants from being successful in entering into the country?
Congresswoman, the law that Congress passed, the law of the United States, indicates that if an individual arrives and is apprehended in between the ports of entry and makes a claim of credible fear of persecution in the country of origin by reason of their membership in a particular social group, they have a right to make that claim of credible fear and pursue their claim of asylum. That is the law of the United States, and we are obligated to honor it. We do not condone illegal immigration. We combat illegal immigration. We enforce the laws of accountability, and we also enforce the laws of humanitarian relief.
Yes, but Mr. Secretary, there are many people who do not have credible claims. So if they're successful in going through this process, then doesn't that send the wrong message in the first place? I agree, we need to make some policy changes here, and that's very clear from our discussion and our discussions with CBP and ICE as well. But I think the point I'm trying to make, Mr. Secretary, is that we say the border's closed, or you said the border is closed, but we're seeing people be successful, and that is incentivizing this process to continue. And so my question is specifically, shouldn't we try to send a clear message that it's not going to be successful? We need to stop these cartels from being successful.
Congresswoman, individuals who do not make a claim for credible fear are removed. I don't. I just respectfully disagree with the premise of your question.
All right. Well, I'll be following up with some additional questions for the record. And I'll be following up with some additional questions for the record. Again, this goes back to the question I asked a little bit ago about specifically not only disincentivizing illegal immigration, but being able to effectively communicate between departments and track as well. I think there are a lot of parts of this conversation that we need some additional answers to, and I'll follow up with questions for the record. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Okay. Ms. Underwood.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Mr. Secretary, I want to pick back up on the domestic violent extremism. I think you referenced this to the response to my operational changes question, but earlier this month, the DHS National Terrorism Advisory System Bulletin warned, quote, violent extremists may seek to exploit the easing of COVID-19 related restrictions across the United States to conduct attacks against a broader range of targets, end quote. Mr. Secretary, what does that broader range of targets encompass? And what do local leaders need to be doing to prepare for this heightened risk as they implement reopening plans?
Regrettably, Congresswoman, some of those may include, for example, houses of worship, regardless of denomination. And what we need to do, and what we are doing, is disseminating information to faith leaders across across the country with respect to the detection of threats, the information that we ourselves have in our possession that we are disseminating to them, and best practices with respect to the hardening of their facilities for the security of their followers.
Okay. Counterterrorism researchers have identified social media as a powerful propellant fueling the rise of violent extremism. So I was heartened by the State Department's announcement this month that the United States had finally joined the Christchurch Call to Action, an international pledge by dozens of countries and tech companies to eliminate terrorist and violent extremist content online. Secretary Blinken stated that at the Christchurch Call Summit that countering violent extremism is one of our highest counterterrorism priorities. Mr. Secretary, given that counterterrorism falls within the DHS mission, what is DHS's role, if any, in coordinating with the State Department to fulfill our commitment to the Christchurch Call?
Congresswoman, I am engaging with our international partners, both in a bilateral context as well as a multilateral context, in a unified and coordinated, I should say, battle against domestic violent extremism. I will say, though, that there was a very important principle articulated by the Secretary of State, and one that we have articulated here domestically, of course, as well, which is that we will battle the domestic violent extremism. We will battle domestic terrorism, but we will also do so upholding our constitutional principles, the constitutional rights, the privacy rights, and the civil rights and liberties of the American public. We are not tackling the freedom of speech, but rather the connectivity between speech and violence.
Yes, sir. So while the pledge to eliminate terrorist content online is a major step forward, our current reality is that social media is a major platform for extremist group organizing. The Capitol attack was largely planned online in public forums, and I was disturbed to read reports that hundreds of extremist militias were still openly organizing on Facebook months after the insurrection. We need to be identifying these threats before they turn violent. Now, 2 weeks ago, you testified to the Senate Appropriations Committee that DHS now has analysts dedicated to identifying linkages between extremist narratives on social media and indicators of intention to commit violent acts. How many DHS analysts are working on this full time? And since you've stated that domestic violent extremism is the #1 terrorist threat facing our country, do you need additional resources to track publicly available online extremist content and identify actionable threats of violence?
I will need to get back to you with respect to the precise number of analysts that we have dedicated to this. I should say that not only do we rely on the excellence of our own analysts, but we also harness the resources in the private sector. Academic institutions have conducted studies and we utilize those, and we do so in open source, through open sources, as well as through contract vehicles. And we have also, you will see in the President's fiscal year 2022 budget, requested augmentation of funds to best address the fight against domestic terrorism and domestic violent extremism. I believe the request will approximate $130 million for a variety of needs and utilities.
Yes, sir. Well, I certainly look forward to reviewing that request and working with you to keep our country safe. Madam Chair, I yield back. Thank you so much for the additional time.
Okay. Mr. Secretary, I know you have a hard stop at 12:30 because you have to go over to the Senate for another hearing. So, Mr. Rutherford, you.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'll keep this very short, Mr. Secretary. I want to talk a little bit about a program that is very important to law enforcement. And I want to talk about it in the context of the expansion of alternatives to detention that are being discussed now for these illegal aliens. Whether you call it a notice to appear, notice to return, and everyone knows that the compliance of those folks who are released with those notices is pretty small. But which is why I think, and I want to speak for and in support of 287G. Now, particularly the GYM model, the jail enforcement model, not the task force model on the street, because I never, quite frankly, I never used that in my community because I thought it drove people into a subculture that made them less accessible to services. But the jail model, importantly, the jail model only addresses those illegal immigrants who have actually already broken some other law in my community, whether it's robbery or aggravated battery, whatever it might be. And I know with your experience as a U.S. attorney, you know the numbers of crimes that these individuals can be involved in. I'm hearing, and I guess my quick question is, I'm hearing that 287G may be eliminated by this administration, by the Biden administration, your administration. And so my question is that true? And is that true for both models? Is it true for the task force model only? Or are we talking about the jail enforcement model also? Because I can tell you in Jacksonville, Florida, we had tremendous success with that program. I was able to remove so many criminals from our community as a result of that. And as you know, Mr. Secretary, I probably removed a couple of hundred of them 2 or more times over the period of years. And so can you just give me your insight on where 287G is going, both the GYM and the task force?
I think if I may, Congressman, articulate what I mentioned in response to a question by Congressman Price, which is I'm very focused on smart and effective enforcement, executing our responsibilities, utilizing our resources to achieve the greatest public safety impact, and I intend to do so in partnership with our state and local law enforcement personnel across the country. I don't intend to divorce our agency from that. I recognize the importance and effectiveness of community policing. I understand that different jurisdictions have different dynamics, and I intend to work closely with state and local law enforcement across the country in partnership to achieve the greatest public safety impact on behalf of the American public. That would be my response to your question.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. And I see I'm almost out of time, Madam Chair, so I'm going to go ahead and yield back and let the Secretary get to his next meeting. Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. I yield back, Madam Chair.
Okay. Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for your time. You've been very generous with it. And with that, the Subcommittee on Homeland Security stands adjourned.